Good evening. Can you hear me all right? Good, excellent, and I think we're ready to begin. I wish I had a video of the stools and the ersatz chairs that have had to be brought in. We thought we had a record-breaking audience last week. This breaks all records. It's wonderful to see you turn out for what promises to be an absolutely fantastic program. So let me introduce myself. I'm Gail Jackson. I'm the moderator for this evening. This is the 33rd consecutive year of the Islesboro Forum, and this is the second of our 6 programs for this summer. So we welcome you. And the quality of the speakers that we are having is just a testimony to the treasure trove of people, connections, and contacts that we have on this island. We are so fortunate to be here. I will mention, as I always do, that we're a nonprofit, and we do have some expenses to support the technical production and some travel expenses of our speakers. So donations are welcome, and I think there is a basket over here. A bigger basket. Last week's basket was not sufficiently large, so that's not to say that we have enough, folks. We're very grateful for anything that you can spare. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the gentleman who is going to introduce our speaker. And I was going to introduce him and identify him as Aunt Miriam's husband. But I thought that's a little too colloquial. We need a little more, pizzazz attached to the person himself. So Martin has agreed to be called a science entrepreneur, and we'll let you figure that out for yourselves at some future point. Martin has a very interesting story to tell about how we came to this point of having the honorable ambassador, former ambassador to Ukraine here. I'll let him tell that story. We're going to have our usual format of speaking by the ambassador for a period of time. He really likes Q&A, so be thinking about your questions, and there certainly are a lot of controversial and provocative questions that we can put to him. He's ready for anything. So I think he's going to speak a little bit shorter time than as usual, leaving more time for Q&A. So be thinking along those lines. And without further ado, I will introduce and turn the microphone over to Martin Phillips to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Gail, and thank you, everyone, for coming out, and good evening. I think we're in for a very special experience to hear about one of the pivotal events of our time from someone who was at the center of a lot of those events and a principal in their development. I've not known Bill for long. We met by chance, and we've carried on a conversation since then, and I'll let Bill go through the particulars of how we met. Bill has been most friendly and gracious, which I think are the characteristics you would like in a diplomat. As you know, Bill was the chargé d'affaires in Ukraine in 2020 when the administration of the US government asked Ukrainian President Zelensky to open an investigation into the Biden's involvement in business and government there. Recognizing the impropriety of injecting domestic politics into international relations, Bill resigned rather than getting involved in something that he thought was unethical. And this is emblematic of Bill's principled life of service. Bill is one of the few hundred people in the United States government who keeps the ship of state on course through calm weather and heavy seas. And I hope that a naval metaphor is okay with a West Point grad. The through line I see through Bill's career is the objective of using the immense power of the United States to make people's lives better here and abroad. It's been a career of true public service, not for personal gain or fame, executed with great personal courage and principle, just to say, I did the right thing. Let's welcome Bill, thank him for his dedication of his professional life to our public service, and generously sharing his time and expertise with us tonight. I give you Ambassador William Taylor.
Martin, thank you very much. Gail, thank you for having me, and it's a delight, it's an honor to be here, to have this opportunity to talk with you. And as Gail said, the favorite part of these kinds of things for me is the conversation after I make a couple of remarks. So questions, disagreements, challenges, this would make it interesting to everybody, including myself. So I really appreciate being here. What I thought I would do, I've been to Ukraine now since the big war started, in February of 2022, since Russians invaded. The second time, we remember that they invaded first in 2014. But since the big war started, I've been there about 10 times. I'll be there again next month. I thought I would give you a quick sense of what's going on in Ukraine at this point, what the people are feeling, what's going on with the government and this kind of thing. I work in Washington at this point, so I can tell you a little bit, I think a little bit better news, actually, coming out of Washington on Ukraine than has been the case in the previous 6 months, which we can get into. The last thing, the third part, what I will try to talk to you about and convince you is that we should care about what goes on in Ukraine. For the reasons that Martin said, I think it's important that, frankly, that Ukraine prevail, that Ukraine make it. And I think it's in our interest. It's in our interest for that to happen, and I'll try to tell you why I think that's true. And then, as I say, the fun part for me would be the opportunity to have a dialogue, have a conversation with you. In Ukraine, first of all, to read the papers, you might think that the Russians are on the march. And that the Ukrainians are on their back heels, and it's only a matter of time before the Russians just take over the country. Well, it's not true. It's not true. So the Ukrainians have been fighting, have been defending themselves, again, since 2014 when the Russians first invaded, but really since February of 2022, which is about 1,250 days that they've been fighting, the Russian army. So they have defended themselves and have stopped the Russian army. Indeed, when the Russian army first invaded in February of 2022, they took everybody by surprise. Not quite everybody. There's the CIA folks that told many people, our CIA saw it coming. But when they told people, including the Ukrainians, that the Russians were about to invade, the Ukrainians didn't want to believe it. The Europeans didn't want to believe it. The Germans and the French said, don't listen to the Americans, don't listen to, they're hysterical. Putin and his foreign minister, Lavrov, said the same thing. Oh, invade, they're being hysterical. Don't listen to them. And of course they did. They invaded. And the Ukrainians, caught totally by surprise because the Ukrainian military had made some preparations and were able to stop them, but not before the Russians got to the capital, got to Kyiv. The Russians were just outside of the city limits when the Ukrainian military was able to stop them and begin to push them back. But at that point, at the point where the Russians had made their farthest advance into Ukraine, and again, close to the capital, there were assassination squads in the city from the Russians sent into the city to go after President Zelensky and take him out somehow or other and put a puppet in. That was their goal. And that will be a theme here of what the Russians have been up to. The Russians want to eliminate Ukraine, and that was their first effort in terms of this military. And the CIA and other, we went into President Zelensky at that time when the Russians were very close, tanks just outside, assassination squads in the city. We went into him, Americans went into him and said, Mr. President, we need you to lead your country. We need you to rally your forces. And we can help you by moving you out into the southwestern part of the country, into the Carpathian Mountains, or into Poland if we have to keep you safe so that you can lead. And he famously said to these people trying to help me, he said, I need ammunition, not a ride. And that galvanized the Ukrainian people. He stayed in Kyiv. He went out to the street. So probably, I know there are a couple people who've been in Ukraine. Okay. You will know, and others will see when you visit, which you should, in downtown Kyiv, there is there's a great cathedral, but also this street where the president's office is called Bankova. There's a Bankova Street, and there is an incredible building there, which all Ukrainians know. And President Zelensky, about the second day of the invasion, went out onto that street and filmed himself with his immediate compatriots there, immediate advisors, and he said into this video that went out to all Ukrainians, he says, I'm here. Yatut in Ukrainian. He says, I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We're staying in Kyiv. And that rallied the Ukrainians, and we saw what happened. The Ukrainian military pushed the Russians back into Belarus, from which they'd come, pushed them back into the eastern part of Ukraine, pushed them back into Crimea that the Russians had invaded in 2014 and occupied up until the time when they invaded big time in 2022. They pushed them way back. And for the past 2.5 years, the Ukrainians have held off the Russians. Contrary to the reports that the Russians are on a roll, they're not on a roll. 2 years ago, the Russians occupied 19% of Ukraine. So 81% of Ukraine is not occupied. 2 years ago, 19% is occupied. Today, after 2 years of holding them off, the Russians occupy 19.6% of Ukraine. It's not a big change. The Ukrainians are holding the Russians off. They're losing a little bit of ground. They're losing a little bit of ground almost daily. A kilometer here, a village here, a crossroads there. But when you look at the map, you can't see that. I mean, there's that 81% of Ukraine that is unoccupied, not undamaged, because what the Russians can do is bomb. And that's what they are doing. And they are raising that, the bombing. They are bombing more now than ever. More drones, missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles are going into Ukraine. It used to be 50 or 100 a night. Then it was up to 400 a night. Now it's up to 700, 800. They could get to 1,000 a night in order to try to overwhelm the Ukrainian defenses. All to say that the Russians are still trying. They can't make very much progress on the ground. They've been pushed out of the Black Sea. This is, we don't read about this very much, but the Russians had blocked off the Black Sea from the Ukrainians, keeping them from being able to export their grain, of which they make a lot. And what the Ukrainians did without a navy. The Ukrainians they don't have ships, they don't have a navy, but with their navy drones, the Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians back out of the western part of the Black Sea so that they can reestablish their trade. And so the Russians have had to move even out of Sevastopol back all the way over to the eastern part of the Black Sea. This is to say that the Ukrainians are holding their own. They're a much smaller population. There are many more Russians than Ukrainians. And so the Russians have an advantage. The Russians have an advantage that they have more money than the Ukrainians, and they can pay incredible bonuses, signing bonuses, to Russian soldiers to get them to go be in the fight. The Russians are also enlisting the North Koreans. The North Koreans are sending 11, 12, 13, some say as many as 30,000 North Koreans up to help the Russians fight against the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians are holding their own against big odds. And they're tired. The Ukrainians they've been fighting, as I say, for 1,250 days. They are very tired. They want this war to end, but they won't end it. They won't quit fighting if it means they have to be under Russian rule. They've been under Russian rule before, in Soviet times, in Tsarist times, in previous Russian Empire times. And the Ukrainians are not going back. They are not going back. They will continue to fight. And President Zelensky continues to lead. He continues to make statements every night to bolster the morale of the Ukrainian people. And he does a pretty good job of that. This is a hard job to lead this country as it's being ground down, meter by meter. So the Ukrainians are holding their own because of their own determination, but also because we've helped. We've helped a lot, and the Europeans have helped a lot. The Europeans actually have provided, in terms of actual dollars or euros, even more than we have, and more than what the United States has provided. The Europeans have. Now, we provided more military equipment, because we have more military equipment. And not only that, we had more military equipment in storage, in stockpiles, so that we could draw those down, send it to Ukraine so that they can use them to defend themselves. And then, by the way, we replenish those stockpiles, buying replacement weapons and ammunition from U.S. firms, U.S. manufacturers, to boost those stockpiles again. But the point is, we've helped. And the Europeans have helped. And the Ukrainians are incredibly grateful for that help. They recognize it. Again, people who have visited will hear the first thing out of Ukrainians' mouths when you come back and see them, thank you. Thank you for what you're doing. Which leads me, that's the Ukraine part of this little story. That leads me to the Washington part of this story, which for the past 6 months has been uncertain. Let's just be clear. We've not really had an indication of which way the new administration, not even new administration anymore, the Trump administration is going to go on Ukraine. And there have been different signals, some good, some bad. We probably all remember that horrible meeting in the Oval Office with the vice president and the president and President Zelensky. That was a low point, clearly. Not long after that, there was a higher point. President Zelensky and President Trump met in the Vatican, one-on-one. This great photograph in the Vatican. You got two presidents sitting there, knee to knee in these chairs. No one else around. No vice president around. No interpreter. No advisors. And that was one of the better conversations that they've had. The United States and Ukraine have agreed on a minerals deal, whereby we will help invest in these rare earths, and funds from that will go into helping Ukraine buy more weapons. Most recently, it's really only about the past week and a half, President Trump has made a major change, a major shift. a major pivot even in support of Ukraine and in opposition to President Putin, which was not, let's just say, well, it wasn't always the case. And people say, well, you know, what caused this? I don't know President Trump, don't know what's going in his head, but what he has said and what we've observed is that President Putin has been playing President Trump. Let's just be clear. He's been stringing him along. President Trump said this. President Trump said that he would have these conversations on the phone with Putin 3 or 4 times. And then shortly after those phone calls, Putin raises the bombing level, as I say, from 700 to 800 drones a night, attacks a night. And President Trump said, that's not right. You know, that's wrong. And President Trump has, I think, figured it out that President Putin is not serious. President Putin is not serious about ending this war. I go back to what I said earlier. Why is he doing that? Why is Putin doing this? He's doing it to dominate Ukraine. He wants there to be no Ukraine. He wants to eliminate Ukraine. He tried earlier and failed because the Ukrainians pushed him back. He has invaded again and has not given up his goal to eliminate Ukraine and reabsorb, he would say, Ukraine back into Russia. So Putin's not giving up, and President Trump has figured that out. I am now convinced. And President Trump, we'll have a conversation. I can see there's a disagreement here already. All right, I'm looking forward to this part. That's my view. My view is, it's a hopeful one, I admit, that President Trump has figured it out. And he has said to Putin, look, you got 50 days. In 50 days, President Trump, I'm going to put sanctions on you that will reduce the revenues you're getting from the sale of oil, which is a third of the Russian budget. They get from selling oil to a large degree to China and to India. And President Trump says, I'm going to put tariffs on anything that comes from Russia, which is not that many. We're not getting very much from Russia. So those tariffs don't mean very much. But what could have an effect is putting 100%, or Senator Graham would say 500% tariffs on China and India if they continue to buy oil from the Russians. The idea would be, if the Chinese and Indians say to Putin, look, we can't afford 500% tariffs on us, so stop it, knock it off, sit down and negotiate. That's the idea that President Trump seems to have at this point. A more important piece of this package that President Trump announced last week is their weapons. And as I say, for a long time, well, really since he took office, President Trump has not provided any new weapons to Ukraine. There have been no requests to the Congress for additional funds. There was even two pauses, suspension of weapons that were already approved going to Ukraine, and they were paused for crazy reasons we can talk about. They've been restored, but there was never clarity about whether or not we were going to continue the support that I said has kept the Ukrainians going. And last week, President Trump changed that too. He's found a way for the Europeans to provide the funds, for the Europeans to buy weapons from American defense firms and the Europeans, the NATO allies, provide those weapons to the Ukrainians. And even better, that same system can work even better when the Europeans take their own weapons, their Patriot missiles that can knock down the ballistic missiles coming from the Russians against the Ukrainians. The Patriots are very valuable to the Ukrainians. They're very valuable to the Europeans. Europeans have some sent to them from the United States, U.S. firms. And the Europeans have said, we're going to provide those Patriot systems that are already in Germany and Norway and in Poland. We're going to send them to Ukraine right now. And then we, the Poles and the Germans and the Norwegians and others, are going to turn around and buy Patriot systems to replace those from the Americans. And President Trump had not agreed to that system before, that idea, that deal before, and he's approved that, and that's now well underway. That's well underway, which is a good thing. It is a good thing. So the two pieces of the pressure that President Putin has decided, that President Trump has decided to put on Putin, the two pieces: economic threat of sanctions in 50 days, in about 41 days now. 50 days, 40 days, that's a longer time. So that's the lesser of the two pieces of this pressure, pieces of the puzzle. The stronger of the two packages are the weapons, and they are coming. And that's a message to the Ukrainians in the first instance. The Ukrainians, I will tell you, again, I've been there a lot since the big war started, and they were worried over the past 6 months. They were worried whether or not we were going to continue to supply them, to help them, to be able to reinforce them, to provide the weapons that they've been using to stop the Russians. And when they saw this, again, I've got good friends in the Ukrainian army and good friends in and out of the government, good friends that I used to work with at the embassy when I was there. The morale was a big boost. The morale went way up after President Trump made that decision and that announcement in the Oval Office with the Secretary General of NATO, who was sitting there by his side when he did this. So it's a message to the Ukrainians that we're still with you. And that's an important one. It's also a message to Putin. It's a message to Putin that says, we're going to stick it out. We're going to continue to provide the weapons to the Ukrainians, so you, Mr. Putin, can't wait us out. That had been his strategy, wait us out. Just wait until the Ukrainians get tired. Well, the Ukrainians are tired, but they're not giving up, as I said earlier. Wait till the Europeans get tired and stop supporting. Well, the Europeans, to their credit, are as strong as we are in terms of the Ukrainians. It used to be that we would be the lead on economic sanctions. We would take the first step toward economic sanctions on the Russians. The Europeans are now taking the lead. I hope we will follow them to put sanctions on. The Europeans' latest ones, this is our 18th package of sanctions the Europeans have put on. They have to reauthorize their sanctions every 6 months. And they have to get unanimous agreement, and it's been hard. But every 6 months, they put more sanctions on the Russians. We used to be the leaders on that. We would do it, and then the Europeans would follow. Now, Europeans are leading on that. But that's an important message. And Putin thought that he could wait us out. He thought they would wait the Europeans out. He thought they would wait the Ukrainians out. He was hoping he could wait. He was hoping that the funds and the support and the weapons and the economic sanctions from the Americans, from his buddy Donald Trump, would mean that he could take over. Well, President Trump has figured it out, that's what's going on. And President Trump has now stood up, and I hope it's true. We can talk about whether or not this is going to last. But so far, I think that's it. So that's the second part. That's the U.S. part. My last part, and then again, the fun part for me is your questions. The last is why I think it matters to people here, people in Maine, people in the United States, why we should care about what goes on in Ukraine. And there are multiple reasons. I think there are reinforcing reasons. And some people will be persuaded by some arguments and others by others. So those, I know I've talked to some people here who've already, I know their backgrounds in national security. And there are people who have been in the State Department or the CIA or in the Defense Department who recognize the importance of some kind of order in international relations, some kind of rules, some kind of norms, some kind of expectations about how one nation deals with another nation, and how one nation deals with all other. And these norms are pretty simple. They are, all nations, big and small, are sovereign. And all nations, big and small, have borders that are not to be violated. And so when Russia violates those norms, violates those treaties that they've signed up for, to those norms at the UN, in bilateral treaties, in conventions, when the Russians violate those norms, invade their neighbor with the intent of grabbing territory. Grabbing territory. I mean, they now occupy 19% of Ukrainian territory, but they want it all. And that order is threatened. If we want to get back to an order where nations respect each other's borders and respect each other's sovereignty, then Russia can't be allowed to win. The Ukrainians have to prevail. And that order matters to us, I argue. And again, that's more of a kind of foreign policy, national security argument, but it's an important principle. So there's that principle. Another reason, I know there are some people who spent time in the military in this room, and we have soldiers in Europe. We are a member of NATO, and NATO has soldiers now reinforced the eastern flank of NATO with American soldiers. If the Russians succeed in Ukraine, the Russians will be face-to-face with American soldiers. They're already face-to-face with some Europeans. I mean, you know, now that when Russia invaded Ukraine, two formally neutral nations, the Finns and the Swedes, looked over and saw what happened to Ukraine, that is, the Russians invading a sovereign nation, and the Finns and the Swedes said, neutrality doesn't get it. Neutrality doesn't protect us. So they asked to be members of NATO, and after some effort, in particular on the Swedish side, they're members. So NATO is stronger, but NATO is threatened dramatically, seriously, if the Russians succeed in Ukraine. That matters to us. We have soldiers there. We have commitments to European nations. That also matters to us. The third reason that I feel strongly about this is more of it's an emotional one. It's a moral argument, and that is the Russians have committed incredible atrocities, unspeakable atrocities. I mentioned that when the Russians first invaded, when they invaded the second time, when they first invaded in 2022, they got to the outskirts of Kyiv. One of the little towns on the outskirts of Kyiv is Bucha. And when the Ukrainians pushed the Russians back out of Bucha, and the Ukrainian military went in, and a friend of mine was in the lead unit of the Ukrainian army that went back into Bucha, they were horrified at what they found. The torture, the mass killings, the mass graves, the rapes, the kidnapping of children. The Russians have kidnapped at least 19,000 Ukrainian children to take them back into Russia, not letting them speak Ukrainian, making them speak Russian, giving them Russian names, trying to eliminate the Ukraineness. And again, it goes back. This is what Putin is after. He wants to eliminate Ukraine. And when the Ukrainians saw what happened to their Ukrainian compatriots under the several weeks of Russian occupation, they were horrified. They were horrified. There had been some effort to have a negotiation with the Russians up until that point in Istanbul. And the recognition, the revelation of what the Russians had done to Ukrainians in terms of these atrocities said, we can't deal with these folks. So that eliminated that. But it's this impunity. It's this lack of accountability. I think there needs to be some accountability for the people who have perpetrated these crimes, but also for the people right at the top, like President Putin, who ordered the invasion. That's just wrong. The International Criminal Court has recognized that and has indicted. So Putin is an indicted war criminal by the International Criminal Court. So that doesn't mean much because they can't go arrest him. But he can't travel to some countries and has had to cancel some trips because if he landed in a country that has signed up to the Rome Treaty that implements the International Criminal Court, they'd have to arrest him. They'd have to arrest Putin and send him to The Hague. But there is that sense that there's accountability is going to be important. So that's almost right. So just to recap then. So I've described a little bit of how the Ukrainians are feeling right now. They're determined they're going to win. They're not going to cave. They're tired, but they want to end this war. There's, I think, kind of good news coming out of Washington. That is, the Trump administration is now committed. And they've demonstrated that in the first instance by these weapons that are now flowing. In the second instance, we'll see about these tariffs that are coming. And then the third point is, I think it's important that Ukraine win this war. So it's somehow defined. They're probably not immediately going to take back Crimea, probably not immediately going to take back Donbass that the Russians occupy, probably not immediately going to take back that 19% that the Russians occupy right now. But the Ukrainians would say, eventually we'll get it back. Eventually, we're not going to recognize the Russian claim to that 19%, to the Crimea, to Donbass. We're not going to recognize it, they say, and we'll get it back. And they remember, by the way, last thing, and then I'll shut up, they remember West Germany, East Germany. And the West Germans never gave up claim to East Germany, even though the Soviet Union at the time dominated East Germany. And as we know, history moved. Soviets went out. West Germany and East Germany reunited, and the Ukrainians remember this. And the Ukrainians say, "Look, that can happen to us. We'll eventually get that back." Ukrainians are basically an optimistic people. They are grimly optimistic, but they're grimly determined that they're not going to live under the Russians again. So, thank you. That was. Let me just stop, and I'd love to have. Thank you. Yes, Gail.
Will you please move into the limelight?
Limelight.
Yes, I know it might be hotter there. We're recording.
Yes, I understand. I understand. Good. I will try to do that. Good. All right, light. All right. Yes, ma'am.
So when Russia invaded Crimea and took that over, it seemed like there wasn't much a very strong response around the rest of the world. How much do you think that emboldened Putin to do this second invasion?
A great question. Everybody here? Can everybody hear the? No. Okay. The Russians invaded Crimea in 2014. The reaction of the Ukrainians and of the international community was not strong, let's just say. Did that embolden Putin to go further? Answer has to be yes. It has to be yes. That said, the Ukrainians were in 2014, the Ukrainians were in no position to resist, frankly. In 2010, after I left for the first time, a man was elected president of Ukraine. He's obviously Ukrainian, but he was very pro-Russian. His name is Viktor Yanukovych. And Yanukovych, president of Ukraine, 2010 to 2014, had allowed the Ukrainian military to be hollowed out. Corrupt, lack of support. The Ukrainians were not able to resist themselves in Crimea or in Donbass. At the beginning, they started to resist, and the international community was not in a position to send military forces either. I served in the 101st Airborne and the 82nd, and they would have been the first units to go. The president was not going to send U.S. forces into Ukraine to defend against it. It wasn't going to happen, and there were some sanctions put on. We sanctioned the people who ordered that invasion, that occupation of Crimea. But it was not, it was obviously, and your question is a good one, it was not anywhere near sufficient to stop Putin, or to tell Putin, don't go farther. Sir, all the way back.
Hey, so thanks for your talk. Really appreciate the perspective. In the context of NATO membership, when we look at Ukraine, President Putin's been coming to the United States for almost 25 years, telling us to back off from his border. And some would say that the invasion of Crimea was to create a border dispute so that Ukraine couldn't become a NATO member. How do you think about that to and fro ultimately in a resolution of the conflict?
It's a great question. That's right. So the question is NATO membership. Putin was worried about Ukraine joining NATO. He had been earlier worried about the Baltics, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians joining NATO. Not to mention Poland, the Czech Republic, Bulgaria, Romania. So the question is, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but there's a historian, his name is John Mearsheimer. Mearsheimer makes this argument. He says, it's our fault. We provoked the Russians to invade. The Russians were just defending themselves. I reject that because, for a variety of reasons, but mainly because when the nations who joined NATO after the Soviet Union disappeared, when they applied to NATO, it was not because NATO was trying to pull them in. It wasn't a demand on the part of NATO to join this defensive alliance that pulled in the Czechs and the Hungarians and the Poles and eventually the Latvians and Estonians, all the ones that joined. It was their threat. It was the threat that they perceived of the Russians. It was because they knew better than we. The East Europeans know, in particular ones on Russia's border, know Russia better than we do. And it's not just Putin. When you talk to the Finns and we talk to the Poles and you hear from them that the Russians have been expanding and threatening them and others for 300 years. I mean, this is not something that's just from Putin. I mean, as we know, Moscow started off, Russia started off as just Moscow, Moskva, this little city, and it's now 11 time zones. And they've been pushing and pushing, and so the Finns and the East Europeans know what they're up against, and they wanted to join NATO. And NATO said, well, if you meet certain standards, if you make it so that your military is compatible with the NATO militaries, then you can do that. And they did. They worked hard, and they joined. Ukraine is trying to do the same for the obvious reason. They have even more reason to be afraid of the Russians. I mean, they have been fighting the Russians now for 3.5 years, and so they know what the Russians are about, and they know that the Russians have never invaded, or never invaded a NATO nation. So that NATO membership is the most effective security guarantee, the most effective deterrent, which the Ukrainians didn't have. They couldn't deter the Russians. And so the Russians invaded. But had they been a member of NATO, so I was in Ukraine in 2008 when NATO was thinking about admitting or starting the process of admitting Ukraine and Georgia, by the way, the Republic of Georgia, into membership of NATO. And George W. Bush, who sent me the first time to Ukraine, strongly in favor of Ukraine joining NATO. And in fact, he came to Kyiv when I was there, and organizing a presidential visit is not trivial. He wanted to make the case when he got to Bucharest, where the summit was, that the Ukrainians really were eager and willing and able and deserving of joining the alliance. He got to Bucharest, he came to Kyiv with Bucharest for the summit, and the Germans and the French said no, he couldn't convince them. Had he done that, had he succeeded, had the Germans and French agreed, and had Ukraine started the process of joining in 2008, We'll never know for sure, but I am convinced that, that the Russians would not have invaded Georgia later on in 2008, and wouldn't have invaded Crimea in 2014. This is to say that nations join the NATO alliance to deter the Russians because of their fear, based on history, of Russian invasion. So in my view, it's not our fault. It's the Russians' fault. Let's just be clear. NATO does, and Putin must know this. NATO doesn't present a threat to Russia. Part of what Putin tried to say to the Russians and to the world in trying to justify this violation of sovereignty of all these treaties that I mentioned. He tried to justify it by saying, well, NATO is trying to take over Ukraine and NATO's going to invade us. Nonsense, just nonsense. He tried other arguments too. He said, oh, there's Nazis down there in Kyiv. But turns out when I got to Kyiv the second time, Ukraine was one of 2 nations in the world whose president and prime minister were Jewish. You know the other one. So, so to claim that there are Nazis down there that are is again nonsense. I go on and on. I apologize, but I'm glad you asked that question. But that is it's nonsense that they were threatened. Yes, ma'am.
Just to follow up on that, so I didn't know about the 2008 NATO membership.
No.
Could you just briefly say why Germany and France objected to that?
So the 2008 NATO summit, every year they have a NATO summit, right? So it just happened in The Hague a month or two ago, a month and a half ago. So this year, that year in 2008, they were meeting in Bucharest. And this is an interesting story. So in 2007, all the NATO nations knew that there was going to be a summit in the spring of 2008, the following year. Condi Rice was the Secretary of State, and Bob Gates was the Secretary of Defense. And the interagency policy workings, many people in this room, I'm sure, have participated in some of those policy discussions. The interagency agreement or understanding was that we, the Americans, were not going to support Ukraine's membership in NATO at the upcoming summit. And that word got out to the Germans and to the French. So the Germans and the French heard that. You know, they do good diplomacy. They listen and they talk to people, and they heard, oh, the Americans are not going to support Ukraine and Georgia for membership. So we, Germans and French, we're going to strongly oppose it. We're going to strongly oppose it. Well, as the NATO summit in Bucharest approached, President Bush got involved. President Bush was getting briefed there were a lot of different issues on the agenda for that Bucharest summit, but one of them was this. And when Condi Rice and Bob Gates and Steve Hadley, who was the National Security Advisor, got to that part, they said, well, Mr. President, we're going to oppose the Ukraine. George Bush said, what? He said, no, we're not. We're supporting that. And they were just amazed. And President Bush told National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, go to Berlin. Convince the Germans that we want the Ukraine to be in NATO for all the reasons that we talked about. Steve Hadley did. I know Steve very well. He went and couldn't convince them. They'd locked in. They said, wait, we thought you told us, months ago that you were going to oppose this. Now you want us to change? There's the answer. So I had 2 questions right over. So the back one and then the front one. Yes, sir.
My question is based on a long period of involvement in Ukraine and Russia. I first was in Kyiv and in St. Petersburg both in 1967, which was a long, long time ago, and I've been involved in both countries' affairs since, and I've taught at Garrett. So thank you very much for your presentation, very clear. I'm very glad to hear you debunk the whole notion that NATO was an issue. In all of my trips to Russia and all the years of involvement, no one ever worried about NATO invading Russia. What Putin, it seems to me, what you haven't mentioned, Putin really saw Ukraine as a threat, not so much NATO originally, but because of the Maidan and the ousting of Yanukovych and the uprising of 2014, which resembled the near uprising of 2011 and 2012.
Absolutely right. Listen carefully. This is important.
So when Putin seized the Crimea, which was right after the Olympics were held in Russia, it was enormously popular in Russia. It regained enormous degree of support that Navalny and the protest, really militant and brutal protest, brutally suppressed protests in 2011 and 2012 put down. And so the issue that the people could actually change the government was something that Putin was very much afraid of and needed to argue. But Crimea has been enormously popular. I'm ashamed to say that all of my colleagues in Russia believe that Crimea is ours, Krym nash. And that even my arguments about international law and all the rest of it didn't have any effect. So this leads up to a question of how you retreat from the ways in which Putin's solidarity, popularity, such as it is, legitimacy such as it is now rooted in the occupation of especially Donetsk and Lugansk, which are now Russian republics, and Crimea.
Well, the Russians say they're Russian republics. No one else does, but you're right.
Well, that's right, but they have been incorporated into Russia as republics, which means for Putin to move Russian republics out of Russia into Ukraine is politically, I think, impossible. Even within his circle, that would be strongly resisted, and within the army, in terms of the enormous losses that the Russians have experienced, which is now a huge weight on the outcome of this from the Russian point of view, that's not going to work. Zelensky is rightly saying we can negotiate this over 5 years. We can negotiate Crimea over 10 years. But I'm getting to my question.
Your lead up is great.
If you were involved in the negotiations, how would you approach the question of the political consequences of Donetsk and Luhansk on the Ukrainian side? Zelensky has some vulnerability. And it's possible that he would have to leave his presidency. Someone like Poroshenko could come in. There are several other candidates who could come in, and he would say, and the Ukrainians might well accept giving up those two provinces, but not the extended area beyond those provinces. The Russians, Putin might be able to say, victory, we've won. We'll take the provinces, you can have the rest of it back, you rebuild them, because the rebuilding possibility is enormous. That seems to be a possible point of negotiation. What's your view if you join these negotiations? Would you push in that direction? If not, what other outcome do you see to this horrific, on both sides, horrific disaster, catastrophic, real catastrophe? Well, but one more thing, the losses on both sides have been just unbelievably large and cruel, and it's hard to imagine it. The only thing that's comparison is the German occupation of Ukraine and the German occupation of Russia, which the Russians have neatly imitated. And the Ukrainians are not entirely innocent in this respect either. So this is another great weight. How do you make these sacrifices acceptable? What did we fight for? What did we all die for?
That's what the Ukrainians are asking themselves. And the Russians might be, but I'm frankly less, I don't care if Putin can't make the case to Russians. I mean, that's his problem. What is our problem is how we support the Ukrainians. A couple of things that you said I think are exactly right on. One is a successful Ukraine is a big threat to Russia, in particular to Putin. If Putin sees, and more importantly, if Russian people see their Slavic brothers that they've been so close to for hundreds of years, the Ukrainians, succeeding in joining Europe and becoming rich like Europeans and traveling like Europeans and having the ability to choose their own leaders, for heaven's sakes, like Europeans. That's a big threat to Putin. So you're exactly right. That he does not want to see that. Your question about can Putin make compromises and survive? I don't know, and I don't care. I don't care if Putin survives. What we have to do is to put the pressure, as I said earlier, put pressure on Putin to realize that he cannot win, that he can't wait us out. He can't wait the Europeans, the Ukrainians, or the Americans out. And this has been incredibly painful and expensive for Russia. I mean, Russia can now buy weapons from one country, North Korea. The Ukrainians are, they've got allies. The Russians have seen NATO expanded, unified. So I was at NATO at the end of the Cold War, and there were only 12 nations in NATO. It was hard to get those 12 nations to agree. The 32 nations in NATO now, as I mentioned, including the Swedes and the Finns, who joined because they saw the Russians invading Ukraine, they are united. I mean, there's some, the Hungarians are giving them a hard time, and sometimes the Turks, and now the Slovaks. But every time they have the NATO institutions have supported, and they're unified in opposition to the Russians. So they're weaker that way. The Russians' allies in the rest of the world. I mean, it's just I'm talking about the cost to Russia of Putin's folly, of Putin's mistake, of his blunder by invading Ukraine. Putin was trying to make some inroads in the Middle East. He had people in Syria. He's lost Syria. He had an ally, he thought, in Iran. They're not the ally anymore. They got their own set of problems. He's got problems in the South Caucasus. People have been to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia wants to leave the organization similar to NATO on the Russian side. The Armenians want to get out of that. The Azerbaijanis are angry at the Russians for shooting down one of their civilian airlines. The Kazakhs, all to say that the Russians have paid a big price for this. Not even to talk about the economy. I mean, the Russians are spending a third of their budget, probably 7, 8, 9% of GDP, probably more than that, on defense, starving the civilian economy. Their economy is, but again, that's the Russians' problem. So when I look at it when I look at the issues, the question for policy, for us, for the United States, what is it we can do? Well, we're not going to do anything to the Russians. We're not going to try to destabilize the Russian regime. We're not going to go against Putin. That's not what we're about. What we're about is reestablishing a sovereign Ukraine, so that Ukraine can stop the Russians in its march, their march toward Europe. That's what we can do, and again, it's the weapons and it's the economic sanctions, as well as the diplomatic that we can do this. But I take your point. And that's a big problem for Putin. He's going to have to figure. Putin has the Russians under such control at this point. People tell me, there's probably some people who've been to Russia recently. I haven't. They won't let me in anymore. I'm on one of their lists to say, don't let this guy in. But I have a lot of people who have, and the oppression in Russia is as bad, some say worse than in Soviet times under Stalin. So Putin has total control of the message. Putin has total control on what Russians hear and see and think and tell to their neighbors and to their pollsters. So if he wants to, I'll quickly go to your last question about how does this end? I think the pressure that we put on Putin to get to the table to negotiate a ceasefire, just a ceasefire. There are other issues that the Russians want to put on the table, but just to stop the firing, stop the killing. And this is what Trump has said. Trump has said, I want to stop the killing. So pressure on Putin to get him to the table for a ceasefire. And that would allow the 81% of Ukraine that's not occupied by the Russians, that's no longer under bombardment nightly, can get on about the business of joining the European Union. I would say go on about the business of joining NATO. That, you know, we'll see. That's down the pike. But get on about the business about developing their economy, their democracy, they're raising their children. Let the Ukrainians, that 81%, develop, even as they have the broader, longer-term conversations with the Russians following the ceasefire. And the one last piece of that ceasefire, that again, this is my recommendation, but not just mine, other people talking about this as well. The Europeans, we haven't talked very much about the Europeans. The Europeans are really stepping up for all kinds of reasons. One is they see the Russians invading a sovereign nation right on their doorstep. But two, they're a little worried about the Americans. The Europeans are a little worried whether we're going to continue to be there. Excuse me. With some reason. And so the Europeans are stepping up, and the Brits and the French and the Germans are getting together to put together what they call the coalition of the willing, with the core being these three big countries, big European countries, but others contributing as well. And they're talking seriously about putting a force of the coalition of willing into Ukraine following a ceasefire, or to enforce a ceasefire, to be sure that the Russians don't invade again, while they're having these longer-term conversations. I think that is as good as we're likely to get. Because last thing is, I agree with you that Putin is never going to agree on the things that he's demanded. Putin has essentially demanded, his demands, he says, we have to get to the root causes of this conflict. And when you press him and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and others, what are the root causes? Root causes are you need to have regime change in Ukraine. You have to promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. You have to promise, the West has to promise you'll never provide weapons or any support to the Ukrainians. So what the Russians are demanding is capitulation, the ability to invade again, which they will do. Again, I go back to what's Putin's after. He's after Ukraine. He's after Ukraine. Sorry, long answer to your question. And I promised the man right in front of you.
Yeah, a terrific discussion. Thank you. It was my understanding that, I'm a little hazy on this, I'm hoping you can fill us in, that when the Soviet Union fell, that Ukraine had nuclear weapons and that they disarmed themselves with some promises from us and NATO and other people that we would take care of them or protect them. Can you just...
I would be delighted. I would be delighted. Yeah, so the question is, wasn't there some agreement in the mid-90s whereby the Ukrainians gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, gave it up in return for a promise from some people, from some nations, including the Americans and the Brits and the Russians, that their security would be guaranteed. And so that was the deal. The Ukrainians were asked to give up, not just asked. They were pressured, leaned on. I mean, President Kuchma was the president of Ukraine at the time, and President Clinton was president of the United States. And Clinton really leaned on Kuchma to come to this, to agree to this, to agree to give up nuclear weapons in return for a promise that, as you say, they'd be taken care of, that their sovereignty and territorial integrity would be guaranteed. The Ukrainians reluctantly agreed. It's called the Budapest Memorandum. And every Ukrainian that you talk to will tell you about, not just tell you, they will ask us, they'll ask Americans and Brits, say, didn't you guys promise to defend us? Didn't you guarantee that we wouldn't be invaded when we gave up the nuclear weapons? Didn't you? And we have to say, yes, we did. So they remember that, and we've let them down. We've let them down. Sir?
Putin was no longer breathing. Would this war have ever started or be continued?
This is a great question. So the question, if Putin never existed, or if he had died, 20 years ago, would this war have happened? I think the answer is no. However, that's not to say that there's not other support for what Putin has done. I think Putin, I don't want to say uniquely, I don't want to say he's the only one, but certainly Putin is the embodiment of a strain of Russian thinking that says we need to be strong again. We need to be leaders again. We need to be back when it was Imperial Russia or even Soviet times. But that's fairly broad. I mean, that's widespread. But Putin has made it almost an obsession. I'm not the first one to talk about this. There are historians, kind of Michael Kimmage at the Catholic University who studies this. He says Putin is obsessed with Ukraine. And further, his analysis, again, I don't know Putin, I haven't met him either. But people who have studied him, have met him, say that it is an obsession, that he thinks that if he can take back Ukraine, dominate Ukraine, bring Ukraine back into the empire or the Soviet Union reimagined, that he will go down in Russian history in the same way that Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. And he would put Joe Stalin in that. We would probably disagree with that, but he thinks it's good to be associated with Joe. So that is the Putin. So I don't think if there had been another person there without that obsession with Ukraine, they would still have been aggressive, and they would still have been a problem for the United States and a problem for NATO and try to weaken it. But I think that, no, we won't know, but I think the answer is no. Yes, ma'am.
So this is a very different type of question. I really appreciate your talk. It's terrific. I was in Kyiv, but way back in 1993, at the end of the Soviet era, things are very different. And Mike, I want to ask a question about the third part of your talk, why it's important for the U.S. to care so much about Ukraine. And I agree with you. My question is there any danger that, or what's your view about MAGA supporters' view about the importance of Ukraine? Because I've been hearing all along, why are we in Ukraine? Why do we care about it?
So the question is, part of the Republican Party, and so strong supporters of President Trump, MAGA, as you've said, have strong views about some things. One of them had been Ukraine. And we know what some of the others are that have been dividing the MAGA, the Epstein things and all that kind of craziness. But on Ukraine, maybe because of Epstein, the Ukraine thing has been pretty quiet. He hasn't gotten much push. Trump has not gotten much pushback for this big reverse. I mean, this was a pivot. This was a big change. This was a U-turn, whatever metaphor we want to talk about. And his supporters, the MAGA supporters, as well as others, have been pretty quiet about it, which in my own view, because I think it's the right answer, I'm glad that they've been quiet. And I think that he can convince them. I think, in fact, we've already seen some of that. Some of the MAGA types, certainly in the Congress, in both the House and the Senate, who used to be pretty skeptical of supporting Ukraine, and have even opposed some of the weapons packages, votes on weapons packages. They voted against sending weapons. They've changed. There are now 87 co-sponsors in the United States Senate. So there's 100 senators, 88 of them are co-sponsoring a sanctions bill on Russia, a bill that would put 500% tariffs, I mentioned this earlier, 500% tariffs on nations that buy oil and gas from Russia. That would hammer them. Just without even talking about what the specifics of that bill, 87 out of 100 senators are signed up to support an anti-Russian, pro-Ukraine bill. And it's getting support in the House of Representatives as well. And President Trump has said, it's probably okay with me. Today, that's a fair point. It is today. Nonetheless, that is a message that there's strong support in the country. When you ask people, polls asked, do you support Ukraine and Russia? They support Ukraine overwhelmingly. It's about 9% that support, 9% of people, maybe 9% in this room, I don't know, that support Russia, but I haven't met very many of that 9%. There is a strong support for this young democracy that is trying to hold off the big Russian bear, and I think Trump understands it. I think he can convince his MAGA supporters for that. Sir, come in here.
Question that you'll probably laugh at.
I won't.
What about NATO now? I know there's a lot of obstacles.
I love that question. NATO now for Ukraine. The question is, what about NATO membership now for Ukraine? I'm on record as supporting it right now. But President Trump is on record opposing this. So he has more votes than I do. And so my own view is it's not going to happen now for that reason. Maybe, Putin caused this U-turn, this reversal on the part of Trump by all the bombing, all the civilian casualties, all the lies that President Putin told President Trump about, I'm really supportive of this ceasefire, except for these things. And President Trump finally figured Putin has been the problem there, and President Trump has figured this out, and maybe that will lead to a reevaluation of this question of NATO. My own view is they would be a benefit to us. NATO would be stronger with Ukraine in, with the kinds of weapons that they've developed, the kinds of capabilities. They're the only ones that have fought the Russians, and they've fought them successfully. So I think they would be a very strong contributor to security on this. Okay, so I had two. Yes, sir. Yes, please.
You mentioned Finland and Sweden a number of times.
Finland and Sweden, yeah.
I remember when...
Could you stand up, please?
When Russia first invaded Ukraine, I remember saying to my wife, can you imagine what the Finns are feeling now?
No.
And we were in Sweden last year, and it was remarkable how much less pacifist friends and family sounded.
A Russian invasion will be...
They're living in fear. But what is remarkable to me is we keep mentioning those two countries. Is there the same level of fear in the Baltic states? Is it in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania? Why uniquely Sweden and Finland as opposed to them?
It is not unique to those two. So everybody heard the question then after. So the question is, we've talked a lot about the Finns and the Swedes who were so struck by the Russian invasion of Ukraine that they dropped, in Finland's case, 3 generations worth of neutrality, and in Sweden's case, 300 years of neutrality. They dropped it when they saw the Russians invading Ukraine, and they moved to join NATO. And, as you say, public opinion supports that in both those countries. Public opinion also strongly supports that, supports Ukraine in the Baltic states, in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Strong. They're right on. NATO is now able to defend Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania because of Sweden and Finland being in much better than we could without them. I mean, just look at that map. And the Baltic states are just so exposed up there without the Finns and the Swedes. So the Baltic states have, and also the Baltic states know the Russians. I've had good conversations with Estonians in particular. They know the Russians, and they are as hardcore anti-Russian and as supportive of Ukraine and as supportive of spending 5% of their GDP on defense as any other nation in NATO. So they're strong supporters there.
We have one last question.
Okay. Can we just I'll take two maybe, and I'll take them at the same time, Gail. It's a deal. All right. So here and here. Okay, good. Those two.
Serious about actually ending the war and stopping this in terms of the Trump administration. Why don't we just step up and instead of doing what I view as a shakedown in terms of in terms of strategic minerals or grain or any of those, and the ineffective sanctions and the ineffective tariffs, because the tariffs don't work. Even on China, those tariffs are going to be there for a bit until somebody squeals and then they'll be off. And so why don't we just go ahead and say, here are the weapons that you need, particularly the offensive weapons. We now say you can use those offensive weapons to push the Russians back or to make the Russians pay attention to what it is. So why are we pussyfooting around with the with sanctions, ineffective sanctions, and the shakedowns? And let's just do it. Let's go for it.
I totally agree. Fully agree. Fully agree. I would say also that these, what you mentioned, offensive weapons, the Russians invaded Ukraine. Anything that the Ukrainians do is defensive. So there are no offensive, defensive weapons in the category. But that doesn't take away from your point. Your point is, why not provide the Ukrainians with what they need to be able to first stop the Russians and then push them back? No argument. No argument. But I will tell you, the Biden administration was reluctant to do that. The Trump administration has only recently come to a position where it's explicitly supporting the Ukrainians. And so it's going to take some time to get there. I think they're moving in that direction, frankly. I think they're talking about weapons, long range, I will say long range as opposed to offensive, but long range weapons that the Ukrainians can use in Russia against military targets. And the Ukrainians have done it themselves. The Ukrainians, with their own drones in the back of trucks that were trucked into 1,500 miles into Russia, and then the trucks opened up, the drones took off and attacked the Russian airfields. The Russians fire against the Ukrainians' civilian targets, and the Ukrainians go after military targets. So we ought to enable that as well. I take your point and don't disagree with you about the effect of sanctions. And as I say, I think that's the least effective part of that. Right here. And we'll talk.
So you haven't mentioned China at all. So what is, does China have influence? How is China playing this? Will China play any meaningful role going forward in how this gets resolved?
Question is China. Are they going to play a role? What's their view? The Chinese are, I think, in a funny position, in an uncomfortable position. On the one hand, rhetorically, they've supported the Russians. Before the Russians invaded big time in 2022, somebody mentioned the Olympics. President Putin visited President Xi in Beijing at the beginning of the Olympics, and out of that meeting came a joint statement that said, we have a partnership without limits. So the rhetoric is there. However, the Chinese have also said, we support sovereignty of nations, we support territorial integrity, we don't support violating those principles, so we want the war to end, is the way they've kind of finessed it. They're also in a funny position as well because the Russians have asked, Putin has asked Xi, and Russians have asked the Chinese more broadly, we need weapons, we need soldiers. And the Chinese have said no. The Chinese have not sold weapons to the Russians. They have given them dual-use equipment and these microchips and other pieces of electronic gear that the Russians use to build their own. But the Chinese have held back, partly because they don't want sanctions, which we have imposed on anybody who sells these kind of weapons to the Russians. We put sanctions on. And the Chinese fear that. They don't want that. And the Chinese know that at one point, President Trump was talking about, 135% tariffs on Russia. Now he pulled it back, as you've indicated. Nonetheless, that's a real threat. So the Chinese are in a difficult position, I think. But the second part of the answer to your question about China is the Chinese are watching very carefully what the Europeans do, what the Americans do in terms of support for Ukraine. And if the Chinese see that support fading, if the Chinese see the Americans getting tired or the Europeans getting frustrated, and the support for Ukraine goes down, the Chinese learn from that, and the Chinese say, well, they are like the Americans are probably do the same thing if we invade Taiwan. They're watching very carefully. This is an important piece. That's not the main reason, but that's an important reason. That's another reason I think we should support the Ukrainians.